Tulasizwe ngabokhala uJehova wakho uzokunqobela. Tulasizwe ngabokhala uJehova wakho uzokunqobela. Tulasizwe ungabokhala nathi nkululeko, ay nkululeko, nathi nkululeko, tulasizwe bo, tulasizwe ungabokhala tulasizwe ma-Afrika, tulasizwe ma-Afrika, ungabokhala nathi kululeko,
I start by thanking the Law Society and the members of the PLO Lumumba Foundation in Sierra Leone, and the good professor and those who have spoken before me on a subject that is now very critical, particularly at this stage in the life of Africa. And I want to preface my conversation this evening with a number of early thoughts about the continent of Africa by a man whom we have come to celebrate as having been ahead of his time, and his words remain evergreen, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah. And there are a number of things that he said which will form the background and indeed the basis of what I'm going to talk about this evening. There are speeches that he gave very early on in his life as the president of Ghana, and this is what the Osagyefo said. Only Africa can fight for its destiny. In this struggle, we shall not reject any assistance and support of our friends, but we will yield to no enemy, however strong. And when we talk about an enemy, if he were talking now, he would, in my view, include COVID-19 as such an enemy. He then went on to say and to talk about the kind of African that we need in order to conquer our problems. And this is what the Osagyefo said. Africa needs a new citizen, a dedicated, modest, honest, informed man and woman, a man and a woman who submerges himself or herself in the service of the nation and mankind, A man and a woman who abhors greed and detests vanity, a new type of man and woman whose humility is his strength and whose integrity is his or her greatness. And then finally said, the continent of Africa is compact, self-sufficient, and unique. Geopolitically, it forms a single unit with its own personality. That is the continent that we are having a conversation about this evening, now very rudely divided into 55 countries, which claim sovereignty and which are weak by dint of that very division into 55 unviable entities. That continent is now locked down and debilitated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Our young men and women are not attending school because it is dangerous to do so. That continent is now locked down so that young men and women and old men cannot travel. If you are in Johannesburg in South Africa, you cannot travel to Eswatini in the neighborhood. If you are in Freetown, you cannot travel to Monrovia. And if you are in Guinea-Bissau, you cannot travel to Conakry. That is where we find ourselves now. And the question that we are asking is whether COVID-19 is here with us for the long haul. It is now very common to hear people saying, post-COVID, we are going to do this. There is no post-COVID. COVID is here to stay. What will happen is that the impact of COVID and the virulence of COVID may reduce in the same way that Ebola came and we largely conquered Ebola, in the same way that malaria came and we largely conquered malaria and now live with the vestiges of it, in the same way that we had yellow fever and we now live with the vestiges of it, in the same way that the dengue fever came and we now live with the vestiges of it. The only difference with COVID-19 is that it has impacted the world in a manner that is unprecedented. So unprecedented it has been that no single country can claim that they have a magic bullet in dealing with COVID-19. Everybody is learning on the go. Everybody is engaged in trial and error. And we are on a daily basis confronted with opinions of scientists and experts, epidemiologists and virologists from different parts of the world, telling us one day that social distancing only reduces the possibility of infection by 3.3%, that wearing the mask only protects us 2.6%. That is one set of experts. Another set of experts are saying different things, but all of us agreed that there is something out there which we have not properly understood, whose impact in our health sector is debilitating. And that thing has been recognized by the World Health Organization as a pandemic, and we have accepted that that is the reality. We also accept that that thing called COVID up till now does not have a cure which is universally recognized. We do so, of course, acknowledging that our kith and kin in Madagascar have, in their attempt to deal with COVID, come up with COVID-19. We do so aware that there are efforts in Dakar, in Senegal, to come up with a vaccine. We do so aware that in different parts of the world, scientists are grappling to find a cure for COVID-19. But one of the most important things that we must recognize going forward is that if there is a single thing that has opened our eyes during this period is COVID-19. The African is no longer thinking in the same way that he or she was thinking 6 months ago. For the first time, our underbelly has been exposed in the most open manner since many of our countries regained our independence. You will remember that several years ago, I think in the year 2001, African heads of state gathered in Abuja in Nigeria and came up with what is known as the Abuja Protocol. And one of the fundamental prescriptions of the Abuja Protocol was that every African government was going to ensure that they would spend at least 15% of their annual budget in the health sector. We now know that that did not happen. 0.7 and 1% of their budget in the health sector. And that is why, therefore, when COVID-19 came, we discovered in very many countries, if it was not in Kenya, that we discovered that we had no more than 200 ICU beds. Then we made that discovery in Nigeria. We made that discovery in South Africa. And what then was revealed is that our health infrastructure was in a very sorry state. So one of the things that many African countries are now beginning to ask, courtesy of COVID-19, that we ought to give practical meaning to the declaration that we make so often. Every other African country is now beginning to recognize that had we adopted the Abuja Protocol, some of the things that we are talking about now, such as the inadequacy of bed spaces, such as the inadequacy of ventilators, such as the inadequacies of PPEs, such as the inadequacy of masks, such as the inadequacy of isolation facilities would not have happened because we would have been in a state of preparedness. And I think that that is a good thing, because sometimes you need something as debilitating as this in order to wake up. Another area in which we have been found wanting is in the area of education. And I say this advisedly and deliberately because when many African countries were seeking to regain independence from their erstwhile colonizers, education and health and poverty were identified as some of the enemies which had to be confronted immediately. And yet, nearly 50 years on average since most African countries regained independence, we discover that the education sector is also underfunded. Of course, you will look at the Fourah Bay College was established in 1827. So it has been there before the continent of Africa was even properly colonized. But even if one were to look at primary education, tertiary education, secondary education in a country like Sierra Leone, you will discover that the modes of instruction of our young men and women can be described as primitive. And you can say that about almost every other African country, excepting very few. And even the ones that we would accept, South Africa, you will discover that the quality of education in terms of technology is only worth talking about when you talk about the schools which were used by the apartheid regime and their children. So once again, in the area of education, we have been found wanting in terms of our inability to mount online teaching, because our young men and women do not have the equipment, and even when they have the equipment, we don't have electricity to ensure that they undertake education in that mode, which would be very easy in countries such as Sweden or Norway or Finland or Denmark. And if it is not education, we have also found ourselves handicapped in our ability to feed ourselves. Many African countries cannot feed themselves during this period. And I will not go into the specifics, but if you go into the areas such as in the Sahelian region, if you went into Burkina Faso, where there is some low intensity conflict now, you go into Mali, you go into Mauritania, you go into quite a number of countries in the Sahelian region, in Ambazonia, in Cameroon, in Central African Republic, and even in the more stable countries, the relatively stable countries such as Kenya, which has had to import maize all the way from Mexico. We are now beginning to discover that even in the area of feeding ourselves, agriculture, we have not invested as we ought to have invested. A country such as Zimbabwe, which at one time was aptly described as the breadbasket of South Africa, is suffering now, first because of the inability of the government to acquire food and a series of other debilitating things which have been exacerbated by COVID-19. And if you leave those areas, you then are able to see that our economies are also very weak. They are so weak that our currencies are now beginning to fall in a very dramatic way. And because we are countries that import from other countries, our weak currencies, and of course, in the absence of exports, we are now beginning to discover that we cannot afford to acquire certain very basic things which we acquire ordinarily from China, Europe, and sometimes the United States of America. So our economies have also been exposed to be very weak. The other thing in which we have found ourselves to be weak at is our inability to supply medicine for ourselves. We are talking about vaccines, but you don't hear Africans talking about vaccines. We hear about the Johns Hopkins University coming up with a vaccine. We hear about Oxford University coming up with a vaccine. We hear about some 2 French doctors at the Sorbonne talking about a vaccine. I don't hear the University of Sierra Leone coming with a vaccine. I do not hear the Czech Ante-Diop University in Dhaka coming up with a vaccine. I do not hear the Obafemi Awolowo University coming up with a vaccine. I do not hear Nairobi University. I do not hear the University of Zambia. Once again, we have been exposed in that arena because we are again discovering that we don't consider research as important. So we don't give money to our universities for purposes of undertaking research. And when you don't invest in research, then you consume what is produced by others over which you have no control. And the absence of funding in research exposes us even in the pharmaceutical sector. If you look at the pharmaceutical companies on which we are relying to get medication, if they are not Chinese, they are Indian or American or European. We are weak once again in that area, and we are discovering that very rudely, but for good reason, because when I get to the tail end of my conclusion and I talk about opportunities, I'll be saying that these things that we see as hurdles actually are opportunities out of whose womb we can get a good child going forward. We have also been, it has also been demonstrated to us that we have relied too much on primary products. We mine our gold, we mine our diamonds, we mine our things, we add no value. Now the world is not consuming those things. And because the world is not consuming those things, or if they are consuming them, not in the quantities that they did pre-COVID, we are not getting as much income as we ought to. And even if you go into the area of oil, if you look at the oil sectors, if you look at the big players in Africa, it is ExxonMobil, it is Shell, it is BP, it is ELF, it is all European companies which are involved, and American companies. And therefore, when at one time, about a month ago, there was a glut of oil courtesy of the battle between Saudi Arabia and Russia, oil became almost useless. So you want to sympathize with countries such as Nigeria or Angola or Ghana, which depend on oil. Once again, it has demonstrated to us that you can't rely too much on primary products. The other thing that we have been exposed to is energy. If you look at a country like Iran, which produces anything between 65,000 and 70,000 megawatts, it means that Iran, with a population of just slightly over 70 million, produces more electricity than the entire sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa. And when you don't have energy, you can't industrialize. Even when you talk about industrialization, we think it is just a high school debate that you are engaging in, but you are not serious about it. Africa has once again been exposed in that regard. Yet we know Namibia, for example, claims, and I think it is a legitimate claim, that Namibia can actually power the entire Africa from solar energy. Combined with Morocco in Sahrawi, they can do that. But for the moment, we cannot do that. And then, of course, you look at other critical areas. In the area, I've already talked about education. But if you look at other areas, in the area of innovation and invention, we talk about STEM, we talk about science, technology, and we talk about engineering, and we talk about mathematics. But if you look at our institutions of higher learning and even the preparatory schools, are we prepared to take the advantages of STEM? If you look at our own areas of innovation, are we innovating? How many patents are registered in Africa? How many patents are registered in the entire continent of Africa? And I dare say that a little country like Israel registers more patents than the entire African the entire African continent combined. That tells you that we are not partaking in the dividends of the fourth industrial revolution, where we are now talking about robotics. We are talking about the Internet of Things. We are talking about technology such as we are consuming now. We are now very gleefully consuming Zoom. We are gleefully consuming Googles. We are gleefully consuming blue jeans, but we are mere consumers. We are not producing. Where are our computer engineers? Why don't I have a system of communication such as this, which is African-based? The Chinese are now doing it. They have their own operating systems in the phones, so that they have migrated from Android. They now are capable. They have their own equivalent of Facebook. They have their own equivalent of Zoom. But we in the continent are just looking and marveling and saying how beautiful it is to Zoom. The new vocabulary in the minds of many Africans. We were Zooming yesterday. But the more you are Zooming, but who is getting the dollars? The dollars are going back to the United States. You hear us in Nairobi or in Freetown or in Lagos or Abuja saying, I'm going to Uberize. You are taking, but who owns Uber? Uber is controlled from the United States of America, or Bolt, which is controlled from Lithuania. So in a nutshell, I think that COVID-19 has exposed our underbelly. But there is a beauty to this exposure. The beauty is that Africans are now beginning to recognize that going forward, we must wake up. You know, I started with Kwame Nkrumah, and I will go to the next segment of my presentation once again by making a reference to Kwame Nkrumah. In the year 1961, Kwame Nkrumah was installed as the chancellor of two Ghanaian universities. The first one was at the University of Ghana in Legon. And on that day, I paraphrase what he said, he reminded his audience that the university was going to be a critical player in the area of the development of the young nation of Ghana and by extension, the entire Africa. A few months later, he was opening the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi in Ghana, and he reiterated the same thing. And why that is significant is that he was reminding us that Africa is capable of doing all the things that all other civilizations have done. And indeed, when you look at some of the steps that have been made by Africa in the recent past, they have been informed by the realization that we've got to do things which are useful to ourselves. And I'll start from the 1980s. In the 1980s to 1980, to be specific, African heads of states and government met in Lagos in Nigeria and came up with the Lagos Plan of Action. And some of the fundamental pillars of the Lagos Plan of Action was that Africa would become self-sufficient. And when we talk about self-sufficiency, we were talking about a number of critical areas. Number one, that we would go into food production, and in agriculture, we would be in a position to feed ourselves. Number two, that we would go into manufacturing, and that therefore we would focus on ensuring that we had energy, and therefore we go into that area of value addition and production. We also recognize under the Lagos Plan of Action that women were critical in the development agenda, and that deliberate efforts would be made to ensure that women who constituted at that time anything between 51 and 52% of the African population, and who are the pillars of African rural economies, would be mainstreamed into the arena of decision making. And that the youth were also very critical in this regard, and that would happen. The Lagos Plan of Action did not, of course, achieve its declared objective. And subsequently, of course, we had the new African Initiative for New Partnership for African Development, NEPAD, which is headquartered in South Africa. Once again, NEPAD said the very same thing that had been said in Lagos in Nigeria. And subsequent to that, we have had initiatives, particularly in the area of women participation. We have had the Maputo Protocol. And the Maputo Protocol was quite clear that you've got to ensure that your women and your girls are given the pride of place in the struggle, number one, to deal with the historical injustices, and number two, to mainstream them in decision-making position, not by dint of tokenism, but actual involvement in the boardroom, in the private sector, involvement in cabinets, in decision-making places, so that you genderize, to use this cliche, the manner in which decisions are made in the continent of Africa. Once again, we fell short. And of course, like the rest of the world, in the year 2000, we found ourselves embracing what we call the Millennium Development Goals, the 8 Millennium Development Goals. And once again, we identified what we needed in order to push the agenda forward. Of course, by the year 2015, our agenda, Millennium Development Goals, have not been achieved by most African countries, and we now have the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 of them. The question that then is legitimate is this. We know that because of COVID, African economies have suffered in a fundamental way. Is it an opportunity for us to be a leader in the world? It is Kwame Nkrumah who said, we are not in the business of competing with anybody.
What we are doing is that we are unique. And in our uniqueness, and at this stage, it is important that I actually state the very words of Kwame Nkrumah as he said them in 1953. And this is what we say, what he said. We feel that there is much the world can learn from those of us who belong to what we might term the pre-technological societies. There are values which we must not sacrifice unheedingly in pursuit of material progress. That is why we say that self-government is not an end in itself. We have to work hard to evolve new patterns, new social circumstances, new attitudes to life, so that while we seek the material, cultural, and economic advancement of our people, while we raise their standard of life, we shall not sacrifice their fundamental happiness. The desire of the African people themselves to unite and to assert their personality in the context of the African community has made it felt everywhere. I think this is our time. It is our time because by God's grace, for those who are spiritually inclined, Africa has not thus far had the very debilitating impact of COVID-19 in the manner, for example, that Spain did, or the United Kingdom did, or Italy did, or India is, or the United States is, or Brazil is. And I pray that we remain as vigilant as we have remained, because it is in moments of crisis such as this that new powers emerge. It is after the debilitating war, the ethnic war of the Europeans in 1945, that Germany emerged to become perhaps one of the 3 strongest economies in the world. It was after the war. We are in a war. Is this not our opportunity? It was after the debilitating war of 1945 that Japan, having been bombed to the ground in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, emerged within a few years as the second strongest economy in the world, after a war such as COVID has imposed on us. It is in 1953, after the Korean War, that South Korea emerged. It is after the Civil War in 1975 that Vietnam emerged. So there is a sense in which a crisis creates an opportunity, but it depends on how you take advantage of those opportunities. And that is why it gladdens my heart that for the first time since our countries attained independence, almost 99% of African heads of states and government are here in the continent. Even when they get sick, they can't go to Europe and America, they'll not be allowed there. The ministers are here. All senior government officials are here. If they are sick, they must go to our hospitals. If they want to eat, they must eat the things that we produce in the continent. If they want to send their children to school, they can only send them after COVID, but they are here with us. There is a sense in which now everybody is recognizing that we have a duty to make Africa good. And that gives us a unique opportunity. And it comes at a time when Africa is already beginning to look at Africa Agenda 2063 in a keener way. There are those who will say, and perhaps there is justification in saying this, that the African Union could do better. I believe that post-COVID-19, African Union will be compelled to do better in a number of areas. We now know, for example, that during COVID-19, we are now beginning to rely less and less on the World Health Organization and relying more and more on the Center for Disease Control created by the African Union in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And we also know that that particular body has now also cascaded its activities into 5 other regions, so that we have a CDC center in Gabon, I think. We have one in Egypt, another one in Nigeria, another one in Kenya, and another one in Zambia. So in the area of medicine, we can begin to become a leader and to de-emphasize our reliance on other parts of the world. In the area of education, we can also become a leader. We are now beginning to interrogate what it is that we are teaching our young men and women. And I think these are some of the promises that are made to us under Africa Agenda 2063. In the area of agriculture, we are now beginning to recognize that going forward, Nigeria and Ghana and other rice-loving countries are not going to import rice from Pakistan or any other part of the world, but we are going to grow it. And I'm happy that the Nigerian government has been, in fact, they had been trying during even the ministership of Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, who is now besieged at the African Development Bank, to try and de-emphasize reliance on oil as a source of income. I'm happy that in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana, we are now beginning to recognize that we can add value to cocoa, so that we don't send it all to Nestle in Switzerland or to Belgium. Even in countries such as Sierra Leone, you are now beginning to recognize that the diamonds that you mine, you must add value to them. And I hope that in neighboring Liberia, we will also begin to focus much more on rubber, and we don't export the raw rubber material to Firestone and other places in the United States of America, but we actually have the finished products. So we can once again, through reliance on science and technology, begin to move in a totally different direction, because COVID has taught us that the more you produce, the safer you are. In the area of culture, for a long time, our young men and women think that culture is not important, but I want you to ask the Nigerian government the kind of contribution that Nollywood makes. Nollywood has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, and they are employing young men and women. And if we do that, Nollywood and all other film production units, whether they are in Ghana, whether they are in Nairobi, Kenya, or in Tanzania, or in Uganda, or in South Africa, that is also going to become another area where we can be leaders in the world culture. You can see that the Chinese are very busy opening up Confucius centers in every other university of Africa. We should discourage that. Instead, we should have centers for African studies at the University of Sierra Leone, at the Ante Chek Diop University, at Obafemi Awolowo University, at Ahmadu Bello University, and at all these other universities that we have wherever they are in Africa, so that we can begin to teach our young men and women the right thing. In the area of sports, you young men should stop watching these things from Europe, Juventus and all other things. That money can be made here. I want us to have a league which is a multi-billion-dollar league. You can have the Freetown Stars, you can have the Enugu Rangers, you can have the Mufulira Wanderers, you can have the Kaizer Chiefs, you can have Gor Mahia in Kenya, you can have Kampala City Council, and we have an African League, so that all those TV rights will now be here, and we will be the leaders in this regard. And if you go into mining, we can make the Democratic Republic of Congo the hub of mining. We can have technology, and that is why I think that one of the things that we must talk about seriously now is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And I'm acutely aware that the African Continental Free Trade Area is already in formation, the Secretariat established in Accra, Ghana, and it will begin operation, of course, in January 2021, once again because of COVID. But it's also important that we pay attention to African Union's declaration that this is the year of the silencing of the guns. As long as we have conflicts in Burkina Faso We have conflict in Mali, we have conflict in Mauritania, we have conflict in Libya, we have conflict in the Cameroons, we have conflict in northern Mozambique, we have conflict in Eritrea, we have conflict in Somalia, we have conflict in southern Sudan, we have conflicts in different parts of Africa, conflicts in the eastern Congo, we and Central Africa. We are not going to create a conducive environment for making Africa great. It can be done. During my own lifetime, I've seen the Chinese reduce poverty from 88% to 0.7%, and yet they don't have the resources that we have. During my own lifetime, I've seen Dubai converted into a desert, into the hub of the world. Africa can do it. But Africa can only do it if we are united and we are focused and we are pulling in the same direction. And that is where I think that leadership is very critical. Writing in 1983, the great Nigerian Chinua Achebe said in his little book, The Trouble with Nigeria, which could very well also be read, The Trouble with Africa, he said the African problem is simply and squarely one of leadership. We've got to resolve the question of leadership. We've got to have men and women in positions, particularly of political power, who love this continent and who know where they want to take this continent. And that is why I no longer believe in this thing called the youth are the leaders of tomorrow, and that tomorrow never comes. We must have something that is called co-generational leadership, so that as it is now, the young men and women who are listening to me, you are leaders. It used to be said in my mother tongue that when mother cow is chewing cud, baby cow looks at how she is doing it and learns in that way. Of course, I'm using the word baby very deliberately. A cow does not have a baby, they have calves. But I'm using this as a term of art. And I'm saying that once you have that, the complaint that women are excluded, that the youth are excluded will disappear, and we'll all have our hands on deck, and Africa will be a global leader. And we can be leaders in many areas. Look at the area of tourism that I've not talked about, which has been debilitated by COVID-19. Africans ought to rely much more on intra-African tourism instead of waiting for tourists to come from Greece, from Italy, from the United Kingdom, from China. I want to see the Ethiopians moving to the Serengeti and the Tanzanians moving to Lalibela in Ethiopia, and the Eritreans moving to Sierra Leone, and the Sierra Leoneans moving to Ghana to see Cape Coast Castle and the Elmina Castle, and the people of Ghana moving to the Zimbabwe to see the ruins of the Zimbabwe Monomotapa Empire. And I want to see the Zimbabweans moving to the ruins of the Benin Wall. And I want to see the Congolese moving down to the Namib Desert to see the sand dunes, and the Botswana and the Namibians moving to the Democratic Republic of Congo to behold the beauty of the River Congo. And if we do that, then we will not need tourists from the rest of the world as our saviors. They will only be adding to ourselves. So, ladies and gentlemen, COVID has debilitated us. COVID will be with us, but we will learn to live with COVID. But this is a great opportunity for us in Africa. It is a great opportunity for us to be leaders in Africa. It is a great opportunity for us to increase, to improve very many other sectors, so that in the next few years, when we want statistics about the African economies, we'll not be looking to IMF, we'll not be looking to the World Bank to tell us, we'll not be looking to Moody's in its moody way to tell us how our economies are performing. We'll be looking at the African Development Bank speaking from Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire. And when we are talking about education, we'll be talking about an education that no longer makes claims that Harvard or Oxford is the best university in the world. Which world? What are they best at? we'll be saying that the University of Obafemi Awolowo and that Fourah Bay, the Athens, is the leading university in Africa, and that Makerere is, and that we'll be teaching people the right things, and we will not allow Fela Kuti to repeat again, even in his grave, "Teacher, don't teach me nonsense." We can be leaders in that area. We will be leaders in research because our governments will de-emphasize the use of money in buying arms and bullets, and instead that money will go into research, and we'll have innovations and inventions, and we'll reap the dividends of the fourth industrial estate, and we will make our own area in computing. We'll have our own media of communication, not Zoom and Blue Jeans and Google. No, we'll have our own. And in the area of pharmaceuticals, we'll no longer be consuming medicine from Johnson & Johnson or Novartis or Roche. We'll have companies in Nigeria, in Congo, in Tanzania, in Ethiopia, and in Somalia, and in Kenya, doing exactly that. In sports, we'll no longer be watching Juventus, and we'll no longer be watching Real Madrid and Barcelona. We'll be watching Mfulira Wanderers, and we'll be watching Abiola Babes and Monrovia Stars, and all our players will be playing here in the continent, and we'll be generating money in the billions. We'll no longer be watching the artificiality of Hollywood, but we'll be watching the reality of Nollywood and the reality of Bongowood, and our movie industry will bring our men and women. We'll no longer be claiming that the best actors are those who are given Oscars or BAFTAs, but we'll have our own actors with a name that we shall get. If it is Ashanti or some other name, we'll have a name for it. And we will have our mining sector. Our diamonds will be cut here. We'll produce enough electricity. We'll feed ourselves. We'll have solar. It can be done, and it must be done. And this is the opportunity, because I can now begin to hear even our kith and kin in the diaspora, whether they are in Antigua and Barbuda, whether they're in Jamaica, whether they're in Barbados, whether they're in Australia or the United States of America or Europe, I can hear them saying, we want to go home. We want to support home. This is the time when we must combine our efforts and ensure that this is done. I look forward to the day when there will be a reality of the African passport. You are in Sierra Leone, you'll only need the African passport and a ticket, and you can come to Kenya. You'll only need a train if you are in the Gambia, and after 3 days, you'll find yourself in Djibouti or in Addis Ababa, so that there'll be no more visa for any African. If you want to transfer your credits from Fourah Bay to Makerere University, that will happen. In a nutshell, it can be done. And history has demonstrated that when young men and women such as yourselves are in the forefront, it can be done. It was done in Turkey in 1908 when the young Turks were in the forefront. We are no longer talking about young Turks, we are talking about young Africans. In 1963, during the Civil Rights Movement, it was young people. Once again, it can be done. In Africa here, when we were regaining our independence, it is young people who are in the forefront. I believe it can be done. It is Julius Kambarage Nyerere who used to say, it can be done. Let us play our part, COVID notwithstanding. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Professor. First of all, let me express my deepest thanks and appreciation to God Almighty for giving us the opportunity to meet on this platform, and also gratitude to Professor Lumumba. I've always been an admirer, a mentee. Thank you very much for honoring our invitation, and we hope to have you someday soon. And to Professor Njai, thank you very much. And to Madam Nasu Fofana for short notice, but yet still you managed to make some time for us. I've always been an admirer from the far back, and thank you for coming to this program. And of course, a big thanks to the PLO Lumumba Foundation. These guys are tremendously huge and great, and they've been impacting so much to the youths in Sierra Leone. Thank you so much, Professor, for such a wonderful initiative.
Yes.
And I want to tell you that the Professor Lumumba Foundation Sierra Leone chapter is doing very great. Thank you. And to all the viewers out there, to the entire Law Society team, to the OEL Law Review, we also say thank you guys for making this public lecture. And to everyone who contributed, thank you. And to Online Sierra Leone Limited for powering this program, providing us reliable and adequate internet service to stream live on Facebook, on YouTube, and on our website. So everyone, thank you so much. Till we meet again, I've been your humble president, as I've always said, Mohamed Wiba. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and have a good evening in Freetown.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
God bless. Thank you.